Hey guys, this is FIDE Master Michel. Today you're gonna learn how to play chess. And it doesn't really matter if you know nothing about chess, it's still fine because we are going to cover everything here from the very beginning. We're going to start with the board and its characteristics. We're going to see the pieces, how they move, how they capture, how we set pieces at the beginning of the game. Also, we're going to see what is check and some related themes, and finally we are going to study some special moves that we have in chess. That being said, let's get started. So let's see how's a chess board, and this is where everything and all the battles are going to happen. It's like the battlefield. So we need to know that there are 64 squares, and these vertical lines are files, and the horizontal lines are going to be ranks. Also, we need to talk about the tilted lines, like this one or this one, and these are diagonals. At the same time, we need to say that when we are using a chessboard, we need to make sure that we have the light square on the right hand. If you're playing with a physical board and you don't have a light square on the right hand, then that's wrong. You need to flip the board because there should be a light square on your right side. Of course, when we are playing online, we don't have this problem. The board is automatically set. So let me introduce you chess pieces. This little one is the pawn. The next piece that we have is the knight. Not the horse, is the knight. Then we have this one, which is the bishop. And then we need to talk about the rook, not the tower. We should say the rook. And then we have the queen, and finally we need to talk about the king, which is the most important piece on the game. And also, when we are playing a physical board, physical chess, it might be confusing very often, the king and the queen. Usually a good way to notice the difference is by observing the king. Usually there will be a cross on the top of the king in general. So that's a good way to notice the difference between them. So at the beginning of the game, pieces should be in a very specific position. The rooks should go in the corners. Then we will have the knights after the rooks. Then we will have the bishops. Then we will have bishops, and then after the bishops, in the central squares, we will have the king and the queen. Now, there is a problem with the king and the queen because it might be confusing sometimes. How do you know where should white queen and white king be? Because these are central squares, and sometimes it's not so clear, especially when you observe that you can play as white and you can play as black. So it's not so clear how you know where the king goes and where the queen goes, because sometimes it will be on your left hand and sometimes it is going to be on your right hand when you're playing as black. So it can be confusing. The way we have to understand this is by thinking white queen should be on the light square. So this is the light square, white queen goes here, and of course the king goes in the square next to the queen. And in front of all the pieces on the second rank, we will have pawns. So it could be like this. All this rank is going to be covered by pawns. And then we will have the same thing for black pieces, like with a mirror. Like the rooks should go in the corner. After the rooks, we will have the knights. And also after the knights, we are going to see the bishops. Then we will have the central squares. And as we said, dark squares, dark square is going to be for black queen, because light square was for white queen. That's the way we have to understand where should the queen and the king go. So black queen here on the dark square, and of course the king will go next to it. In front, of course, we will have the 8 pawns, so it could be like this. We need to understand how worth are pieces, because they are clearly not worth the same. Depending on how they move and how they capture, they are worth something. So we're going to say that the rook is worth 5 points, and the knight and the bishop are both 3 points. We're going to learn later that very often the bishop is very slightly better than knights, but well, in general we should say that they are both 3 points. Then we have the queen, and it is going to be worth 9 points. And then we need to talk about the king, which is going to be infinity. as the king is the most valuable piece in the game, and if you lose the king, you lose the game. We don't have a way to measure how worth is the king. We just say it's infinity. It's the most valuable piece in the game. And well, the pawns are going to be worth 1 point each of them. We're going to see how pieces move, and we're going to start with the rook. The rook can go up and down, and also it can go right and left. So it can move, in general we're going to say it can move over the files and the ranks, as many squares as we want. So a rook here can go, for example, to this square, or also a rook here can go to this square, or I don't know, to this square. Then we're going to talk about the bishop, and the bishop is going to move over diagonals. So it can go over here, over here, over here, or over here. One more time, as many squares as we want. Something interesting about the bishops is that we have 2 bishops, and one is going to cover the dark squares, and the other one is going to cover the light squares. So in general, at the beginning of the game, we will have a dark squares bishop and a light squares bishop. Of course, this one is only moving or controlling dark squares. It's never going to be able to control a light square. And the same thing, but with opposite color, is going to happen with the light squares bishop. Then we're going to talk about the queen, and the queen is a very powerful piece. It can move a lot because it can go up, down, right, and left, but also it can go over the diagonals. So it's like a rook and a bishop at the same time. If you want another way to understand how the queen moves, it can go over here, over these diagonals. So also it can move as many squares as you want. As you can see, it's the most powerful piece. That's why it is worth 9 points, more or less similar to 2 rooks or to 2 bishops and a knight, something like that. Well, after the queen, we need to talk about the king, and the king is basically moving the same way the queen does, but only 1 square. So the king can go like here, here, or here, you see, everywhere, but only 1 step. Sometimes we say that the king is like an old man, can only move 1 step everywhere, but only 1 step. After the king, we need to talk about the knight, and the knight is a little different, a little harder maybe to understand, because the way the knight moves is a little different. The knight is going to move on L shape. It's not a line, a straight line. It's going to be L shape. So, for example, a knight here can go here, and always the L is going to be by 3 steps or 3 squares L, like 1, 2, and then 1 step to the side, and 1, 2, and 1 step to the side. So always like an L, but everywhere. So for example, we can talk about here, 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 here. So the knight in the center can go to 8 squares. Let's see, 2 and 1 to the side, or 2 and 1 to the side. And we can see it, for example, over here, 1, 2, 1 up, or 1, 2, 1 down. That's the idea. 1, 2, and 1 to the right, or 1, 2, and 1 to the left. That's the idea with the knight. Is the only piece that can jump over other pieces. And we're going to understand this later, but the idea is that, for example, if there are 2 pawns here, also a pawn here, and a knight here, or let's say a bishop, this knight can still go to this square. It's not wrong. It's something we can do, because the knight is the only piece that can jump. Finally, we're going to talk about pawns, and well, the pawn is also a little special. The pawn is always moving ahead, so this means that a pawn cannot go back. That is never going to happen. It's the only piece that is restricted in this way. So you can move the pawn ahead 1 step, and that's it. That's the way the pawn moves. Something interesting is that at the beginning of the game, when the pieces are, when they haven't moved, when they are in the initial at the initial position, they can move either 1 or 2 steps. That's like some kind of exception. At the beginning, at the initial position, the pawn can move either 1 or 2 steps, as you prefer. Like here, this pawn can go, for example, here, and that's fine. That's something we can do. But also this pawn can go here when you move it, if you want. And also, let's say your opponent plays something, and here you can do the same thing with another pawn. Like, you can go here if you think that's the best, or if you want and you think it's a little better, you can go 2 steps ahead. After this, all the time you're going to move only 1 step, and that's the only option you have. You cannot move more than 1 step once you go out of the initial position. Also, something really interesting about the pawn, the rule of the game, is that when the pawn gets the back rank, this line over here, the pawn can promote, is the word we're going to use for this. And it means that the pawn turns into some other piece. And this some other piece can be either a knight, a bishop, a rook, or a queen. It cannot turn into another pawn. That's not a legal move. And also, of course, it cannot turn into another king. That cannot happen. So in general, we are going to promote to queen most of the time, because as you know, it's the most powerful piece. But also in some specific situations, we can promote to knight, bishop, or rook. That can also happen, but not very often. So we have already learned how pieces move, but now we need to learn how pieces capture, because not necessarily it's going to be the same. So, for example, if we are talking about the rook, it is going to capture the same way it moves. For example, there is a bishop here. We said the rook moves over the file and over the ranks. So if there is a bishop here, the rook can just come and capture the bishop. It could be like this. Takes the bishop and it stays exactly at the same square where the bishop was previously. Also, if there is a knight here, the rook can go and capture that knight over the file. Then we're going to talk about the bishop, and it's pretty much the same. It captures the same way it moves. For example, if there is a bishop here, our bishop can take it, just like this. And also if there is, I don't know, a knight here, our bishop can take it, just like this. After the bishop, we talk about the queen, and it is going to capture the same way it moves. So if there is another queen over here, our queen just takes it over the diagonal. That's totally playable. And after the queen, we should talk about the king. Like, let's say black plays at some point the knight over here, then our king can just take that knight. It captures the same way it moves. Well, after the king, we should talk about the knight. And one more time, it is going to capture the same way it moves. Like, if there is a rook here, our knight can play 1-2 and 1 to the side, and it's taking that rook on L shape. And here we have the difference when we talk about the pawn, because the pawn is the only piece that is not capturing the same way it moves. So we said that the pawn is moving always ahead, never going back, and only 1 step, unless it is at the initial position where, if you want, it can advance 2 steps. That's how the pawn moves. However, when we are talking about captures, the pawn is not capturing ahead like this over the file. The pawn is going to capture over diagonals, and also only 1 step, always, no matter whether the pawn is at the initial position or wherever it is, always 1 step on diagonal. That's the way the pawn captures, and also always ahead. I mean, never back, always ahead. Well, let's see an example. Let's say you play pawn here. Let's say black plays pawn here. Then we can capture that pawn over the diagonal 1 step. We can take it, like pawn takes pawn, and the other pawn, of course, is gone. So now we're going to make a test to see if you really understood how pieces capture, and also to see if you can visualize the captures our pieces can do. So it's like a training test. I'm going to ask you about some white piece, and you will need to tell me what is the piece you can capture with that white piece. So for example, the king can capture 1 piece here, so which is that piece that the king can capture. The king can capture this pawn over here. Let's talk about the queen. What black piece can this queen capture? I'm going to say it very soon. This queen can capture the bishop over here. Let's talk about the rook. Which black piece can this rook capture? This rook can capture the pawn over the right side. And then we need to talk about this bishop. There is one black piece that the bishop can capture. I will say it very soon. The bishop can capture this pawn over here. Let's see the knight. What can we capture with the knight? The knight can capture the queen. And finally, what can we capture with some of our pawns, with one pawn? There's something we can take. I will say it right now. This pawn can take over here. Remember, we said it moves ahead over the file, but it can capture over the diagonal. We need to understand very well what is check. So when a piece attacks the enemy king, we're going to say that we are putting the king in check. Or we can also say that the king is in check. So for example, in a position like this one, we move the queen to this square, and then it is going to be attacking the enemy king. So we can say that black king is in check in that position. Also, we can say that white queen is putting the king in check. Also, there are 3 ways to get rid of a check, and I'm going to show you the 3 ways we have to do that. For example, imagine the same position where we are playing the move, okay, something like this. We are playing the move here, queen here, attacking the king, and there are 3 ways to get rid of the check, and these 3 ways are: you can move the king to a safe square where there is no danger, where there is no threat. Like the king can go here, there is no danger on that square, or here, or here, or also over here. Black king cannot go here because that square is also controlled by a white queen. So that's one of the 3 things we can do. You can move the king to escape from the check. Another thing we can do is to block the check. So the queen is putting the king in check over this line, so they can put something in the middle. For example, black can play bishop here, and then it's like covering the king, like protecting the king with a shield. So no more threat on our king. That's another thing we can do, like block or cover the check. And finally, another way to get rid of a check is by capturing the piece that is attacking the king. Like the queen is attacking the king here, black can just capture that queen, and then no more check. The king is going to be safe. Like knight takes queen, and this is totally okay for black. They are fine. Also, something we need to say is that if the check is with a knight, one of the 3 things is not going to be playable, and it is blocking the check is not an option. Like imagine we play knight here, and then we're attacking the king, so the king is in check, and they cannot block the check. That's something special about the knight. So there's no way to block the check with a knight. That does not exist. Remember, we said that the knight is the only piece that is jumping over other pieces. Imagine there is a, I don't know, knight here and the bishop here, or the pawn here, and we can still play knight here and it's still check. There's nothing they can do to block the check with the knight. However, they can still move the king if there is a check with a knight. Like imagine we play knight here, they can move the king, for example, to this square, and this is still okay. Or they can also capture the knight. If they can, if there is an option to capture the knight, that's also totally playable. So they can play pawn takes knight, like this, and this is still fine. If in some position there is a check and the other player cannot move the king because there is no available square, and they cannot block the check, and they cannot remove the piece that is putting the king in check, then that's what we call checkmate. And let me show you an example, very basic but also very important and very typical. A position like this, white plays queen here, and black king is in check, and they cannot go here or here because those squares are controlled by the queen. Same thing with here or here, because the white king and also white queen are controlling those squares. Also, black cannot take this queen because it's protected by the king, so that's not a legal move. And obviously, black cannot block this time. They don't even have other pieces to block, but also there is no space to block. So, as black king cannot move, cannot block the check, or cannot capture the piece that is putting the king in check, then we are going to say that this is going to be checkmate. By the way, we're talking about the king not being able to capture this queen. There is a rule in the game where we say that two kings can never be too close. Like black king can never come next to our king. So let's say a position like this, and for example, black king will never come to one of these squares. That's not going to happen in the game. That's not a legal move because two kings cannot be too close. It's a rule of the game. Also, it's a very clear rule because the white king is controlling those squares. So if black king goes there, it could be in check. So in general, we say that is not going to happen. That's not a legal move. So that's what happens with check. And with checkmate, we need to understand also one more thing, and it is stalemate. The idea with stalemate is that there is no legal move, but the king is not threatened. So let's see an example. White plays here queen to this square, and it is black's turn now. But they don't have a legal move because this square is controlled by the queen, same thing as this square or this square. So black king cannot move, but the king is not in check. So this is what we call stalemate. When you cannot move, but your king is not in check. That's the difference. In checkmate, you cannot move, but your king is in check. So we can see more examples about stalemate. We need to understand this very well. For example, let's say there is a pawn here, and white plays the same move we were saying, like queen here. This time is not stalemate because, okay, they cannot move the king, but they have other legal moves. So stalemate is not only about the king, it's about all the pieces on the board. It's about legal moves in general. So as they have all legal moves, they actually can still play, and the game is still going, and probably in the next move, white is going to win by checkmate when they put the queen here, attacking the king, and controlling all the squares around. Finally, we're going to talk about two special moves that we can have in chess. I'm talking about castling and about capture en passant. So let's see what is castling. Imagine a position like this. Here we can play something surprising, and it is this move. King over here, and then rook over the other side. This is what we call castle. The idea with castle is that you're going to move the king 2 steps over one side, and the rook is going to jump and go to the other side of the king. And it could be, as we were saying, like this. Also, we need to say that there is a short castling or castling king side, and long castling or castling queen side. It's the same idea, basically, but over the other side of the board. So let's say something like this. Here we can also move the king 2 steps, and the rook goes over the king up to the other side. It could be like this. 2 steps, and the rook goes over the other side. Those are exceptional moves that we have in chess. There are certain situations where we are not allowed to castle. Let's assume we are playing pawn here, and I'm going to show you 4 situations where you cannot castle. It's not a legal move. So if your king is in check, like here, it's threatened by an enemy piece, I'm not allowed to castle. See, I cannot castle. It's not a legal move. However, if I block the check, the bishop moves, now I can castle. It's totally okay. Also, we cannot castle if we already moved the king. Let's say I play king here, king here, they play knight here, I go back, and then I want to castle later. I'm not allowed to castle because I already moved my king. Another example where we cannot castle is when an enemy piece is controlling one of the squares the king has to go over. So let's say black plays pawn here, and then bishop here, and then they capture. Okay, now the bishop is controlling this square. So I will try to castle, and I cannot. And that's because an enemy piece is controlling one of the squares the king has to go over. And finally, another situation where we are not allowed to castle is when we already moved the rook off the side where we are planning to castle. So if I play rook here, for example, they play knight here, I go back, and then I try to castle. I'm not going to be able to do that because I already moved the rook off that side. However, I might be able to castle over the other side. For example, I develop the knight, the bishop, and the queen, and then after that, I will be able to castle queen side like this. About the capture en passant is a special way to capture, let's assume we have a position like this where black plays pawn here. When a pawn comes from the base and it advances 2 steps and arrives side by side with an enemy pawn, then we can see what we call capture en passant. And it is going to be like this. The pawn comes over here and the other pawn on d5, on this square, is going to disappear. So let's say we capture like this, and then we are taking en passant. The other pawn is gone. That's a special move. The idea of the capture en passant is that we can only take it. We can only do the capture en passant if we want. If you think it's good for your position, you can play it. But if you don't think it's a good idea, if you don't think you are improving your position, you don't have to capture en passant, and you can play anything else. If the pawn does not advance 2 steps in the same move, like let's say they play pawn here, and then in the other move they play pawn here, we cannot do the capture en passant. And also we need to say that if they play pawn here, but we don't think it's a good idea to take it by now, and then we, for example, move the knight, and then after they move the knight, then we think now it's going to be a good idea, for example, we're not going to be able to take it. Like, let's try, you see? It's not working. Because the idea is that we can only do the capture en passant at the moment the pawn came side by side with our pawn. Only in that turn. Like, only here we can capture en passant. If you move something else, you won't be able to do the capture en passant. It's only at that moment right after the move of the pawn. If you guys have any question, let me know in the comments. In lesson number 2, we're going to learn notation in chess, but also other really important things like basic stuff we need to know when we play our first chess games. The video is going to be over here once it is ready. Thank you so much, guys. Like, subscribe. See you on the next.